more states started to secede, so this was a pretty big deal. I mean, the Southern Republic was huge. Even Virginia joined the South. In Richmond, Virginia, a huge crowd marched into the state capitol building, lowering the American flag, and ran the new Confederate banner. They were all so excited, a bunch of college kids thinking that this was like a prank or something. And so an 18-year-old student from the University of Virginia in Charlottesville wrote, "The news of the secession has reached here about 10 o'clock amid shouts. War, war, war." Seems like propaganda if you ask me. This goes into more specifics of the Civil War, but I think we brought up enough to be curious about the alternative, which we'll cover later as we visit the fort and talk about all these cannons. If you were to ask me, the entire narrative of slavery becomes questionable as soon as they hide all other history of Moorish cultures. You see, we know of many stories, such as we've all heard of the three wise kings, and we all know that one of them is black. Yet, we do not learn about any of these black immigrants or advanced black nobles who once were in control of the ancient and old world. They seem to conveniently skip over this in order to portray this narrative of slavery that is still being used today with modern politics. St. Maurice is not a caricature, but a depiction of a noble knight from Germany, and this connects with the royal Moorish families of Germany as well. You see that they all have coat of arms, many of which to depict savages, but what if this is but a symbol to depict their plans and overarching goal with achieving their aim? You see, if you had a coat of arms, you were worthy. If you did not, you essentially did not have a soul or ID. You were not a part of the royal arms. These symbols are on the crest to refer to each family's duty and function. The Moors serve the purpose of fulfilling out certain narratives across the populace as indicated by the coat of arms. Remember, this is a coat or banner, a symbol of arms. What are arms? Weapons, assets of a military, used in warfare, whether spiritual or physical. In Benjamin Franklin's Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind from 1755, we get some interesting stuff being said. So listen to this. Quote, "And since detachments of English from Britain sent to America will have their place at home so soon supplied and increased so largely here, why should the Palatine Boers be suffered to swarm into our settlements, and by herding together establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be numerous as to Germanize?" Wait, so what are they talking about here? Germanize? Instead of us anglifying them, and they will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion. Complexion? We continue. Which leads me to add one remark, that the number of purely white people in the world is proportionally very small. All of Africa is black or tawny, Asia chiefly tawny, America, exclusive of the newcomers, wholly so, and in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally of what we call swarthy complexion, as are the Germans also." End quote. Swarthy? So he's saying that most of the world right now in Africa is black or tawny, being brown or yellow, and that all of Europe essentially during this time were what he called swarthy. Wait, what? So the Spanish, which we know for a fact that Moors owned Spain in history, but the Italians, French, Russians, Swedes, and Germans were swarthy? If we look up this definition, it literally means dark tone or mixed, just like Charles II was called the Black Baby. These royals were all swarthy. He says that these people are scouring the planet and clearing out the woods, so hold up. Sure, maybe it's true that white people were in low numbers, but that doesn't mean that they're parasites or the enemies. It just means that they come from a rare climate where the sun isn't so harsh on their skin as with the north. Yet, we're told in history that all of European nobles were white? Don't misinterpret me either. This isn't Wakanda. I'm just saying that there's something really fishy going on with all this stuff, and we need to start asking questions on how we got here. Why did these nobles from Europe, who are said to be swarthy and also a part of secret societies and occult orders, why are they giving us this narrative of slavery that then put all of their people into identity crisis when Moorish history and royalty truly goes back thousands of years? It doesn't start in Africa, and for some reason when it comes to Southern American history, all they want to teach us about is these goulash slaves that were illiterate. Well, I'm sensing BS, and we're talking about some multifaceted bloodline operation controlled by the double-headed phoenix that then hijacked the entire world. In other words, Rome and the Vatican never lost its power. It was just moved into the new church, the new Atlantis. These secret societies such as Skull and Bones, Freemasons, Rosicrucians, Knights Templar, Knights of Malta, and the secret Venetian black nobility. This is not a far-fetched concept. Each one of these subjects can be thoroughly researched, and after increasing one's skill in symbolic interpretation, one can begin to see a whole new story unfold, one that was left behind for the public to become privy to once they become aware enough to see it. We finally have arrived at Charleston Unveiled. But first, we must break down Charleston's early architecture and early influential styles, as it is crucial for us to know. I'm in possession of a book that contains over 500 documented buildings in Charleston from 1670 to the beginning of the Civil War. What we're dealing with when it comes to Charleston architecture is this whole Greek and Roman revival. Now, there are three main architects that we are given who are responsible for Charleston's early architectural design. The architecture of Britain and her colonies were shaped by the idea of three scholarly architects: Andrea Palladio, Robert Adam, and Welby Pugin. Different styles of architecture will then be attributed to these three main architects. And also, if you look up each of these architects' bio, you will see that they're connected with the wealthy and they're all Freemasons, just saying. So Palladio was obsessed with Romans and their ruins, and so he argued that Roman temples should be the basis for the homes. Robert Adam argued that Roman palaces were more appropriate rather than temples for the design of homes. Welby Pugin argued that Christian or pagan architecture should be the design for not only houses, but the churches as well. The explanation behind all the porticos in Charleston is because Palladio believed that English houses should resemble Roman temples, and that weirdly, the ground floor should be like a podium. So this is the explanation for why the buildings have their entrance higher up and you have to walk up these stairs for most of these buildings to enter the house. If it was because of flooding, you'd think they wouldn't have so many basements or crawl spaces. Adam was responsible for these extravagant interiors with many rooms that were supposed to be inspired by Roman palaces. The architecture from 1740 to 1790 were Palladian in design, and from 1790 to 1820 they were Adamesque in design. So they tell us that this Adamesque style dominated the US during this time. So remember how we were saying that Charleston started off as a medieval fortified city? And here, they're telling you that they wanted to build palaces and Roman temples for homes. So, as you try to picture this for a second, they're saying that these drunk sailors that put mercuries in their orifices and then spend the night in the brothel, that these are the people who not only build these structures, but they were all designed so that they could be used in such a lowly, disgusting fashion. I mean, Palladio is referenced literally comparing his architecture to a human body, where he references Vitruvius and all this deep philosophy on how they designed these buildings to be spiritually aligned, yet they came in, got drunk, shot everywhere, and had massive orgies because remember, all you needed was faith and you were saved. So when we talk about these old world buildings resembling Roman Victorian architecture, it's because They literally try to explain it off as these colonists were intellectuals and had these advanced architects creating all these buildings. But guys, architects don't build, they just do the designs. Who built these structures? They tell us that the slaves did it under the control of these drunk Puritans who were treating these black people as subhuman, yet they possessed the creative and artistic talent to create all these magnificent structures under such hostile conditions. Pugin was the Christian, pagan, Gothic guy. He's the explanation behind all these churches, and for some reason, he argued that facades should be asymmetrical. Which is weird because he's responsible for all the Episcopal and Catholic churches in Charleston, and Episcopal just means that they're both Protestant and Catholic. If you read their whole what we believe thing, it's the exact same thing. God loves you unconditionally, no matter what, even if you commit horrible crimes of murder or assault, and even if you love to go to brothels, even if you love to move dead bodies of your local populace multiple times throughout history, and even the entire land is built from the dead bodies. It's all okay as long as we build these churches and pay the 10% and have faith. We are loved unconditionally. Or at least that's how it comes off when you break it down. So this early stage was not really the Greek revival yet. They say it wasn't successful because Benjamin Henry Latrobe, which, would you look at that, he was an English-born Moravian architect of French descent, and this connects back to the Biltmore video with the Vanderbilts, but this master Freemason, which all these officials were Freemasons, and I guess we're just not supposed to take note of this, but Benjamin Henry comes in and he trains Robert Mills. And so this Robert Mills guy, he's very important. He's the architect that we consider in American history to be the first professional architect. Everyone else was essentially hired by royalty or funded by the state. This was the first career professional with a portfolio to ever be introduced in the United States to this degree. Now, this took me some time to connect, but about a year ago, we learned about that bridge in Poinsett that literally is in the middle of nowhere. Regardless of their capabilities of building this structure, I can tell you right now that that bridge is going nowhere. And there wasn't a town for hundreds of miles, so there really wasn't any infrastructure to build that bridge, yet there it is, sitting there with its Gothic and medieval design as if it was from another age. Yet, they tell us no, Robert Mills built this. They were so eager to build this in the most difficult way possible because of this Greek revival. So, you want to revive Greek architecture, but disregard their philosophy and knowledge in waste management? They say that there was a code in place and law that would require that there be a single design vocabulary, all the way from the materials used. They have this all planned out with their explanations. They literally call Charleston a neoclassical city. We must take into consideration that this same exact style was being implemented all over Europe, not just in Britain, but also in Holland, Germany, and many other northern European countries that all had the exact same style as Charleston. But here's what's so crazy about Charleston. Some of these buildings, even in the mainstream narrative, go back to the 1670s. We'll talk about one of these buildings shortly, and when you walk around East Bay Street with Rainbow Row, you're walking in colonial Charleston. And so, think about this for a moment. They have painted over these buildings and added a thin little layer of stucco, and they hide how old these buildings really are with these renovation methods. These buildings are the exact buildings that you see in almost every downtown for a variety of different cities. This really brings us to question the dates on these buildings because in other cities we see the exact same style, yet they date it to 200 years later in the 1850s. So anyways, this whole Greek revival stuff can be traced to these Rosicrucian Freemasons and Moravian family bloodlines such as Latrobe, Carl Friedrich Skinkel, and Claude Nicolas Ladeau. They are all part of these Lutheran Protestant churches, which, in their founding, started as secret societies controlled by branches of the royal bloodline. Interestingly, the second phase of the revival is due to Kahal Kadash Beth Elohim, or KKBE. This is the oldest synagogue building in the United States, with massive porticos and organs inside and everything. Looks like a Greek temple to me. But yeah, this Robert Mills guy, and I have a whole book on him, he has a huge portfolio. He was the first native-born and American-trained architect, also responsible for the Washington National Monument. He is responsible for hundreds, if not thousands, of buildings throughout Philadelphia, Baltimore, Columbia, Washington, and many other cities, but Charleston is one of these as well. They say he came up with this mill design, which we'll be talking about mills later. Here is the mills design for the South Carolina College in Columbia. He also designed many churches like the Monumental Church in Richmond, Virginia in 1812. The Congregational Church in Charleston, 1804, or Circular Church, is a very interesting piece of architecture because we have a photo of this when it was destroyed during the Great 1861 fire. But if you look closely, this is an entirely different church of a slightly similar design. And the weird thing is that they show you this when you walk in or take these tours in these museums, just so you know that Charleston picked itself up after the fire. But yeah, no, those are different buildings. And Charleston literally had maybe 100 or more different churches, and they are all really Protestant, just slight differences in denomination. I really don't understand the need to build two massive churches right by each other, and they do this a lot in like these early American cities. When first creating a city, I mean, these people haven't even figured out waste management, and most of the town were a bunch of drunks. So they tell us that they rebuilt the circular church after the Great Fire of 1861 and after the Civil War, but I'm not sure if I buy it. They just picked up another old world building and renovated it. We will see proof of this later. So I type in Robert Mills photo, and there's literally only one photo of him, and it's creepy as hell. Stare into this guy's eyes and tell me that you trust him. He created the Washington Monument in DC and Baltimore, and both these structures are incredibly suspicious if they're saying that these weirdos built all of this. Just look how magnificent these structures are. I just find it hard to believe that they truly thought they were capable of building this, yet they were actually going to try and pull this off, and Mills wanted it to be the biggest structure in the world, he said. Look at these early paintings. All we have for proof of construction for Robert Mills being behind these Freemasonic buildings are these little sketches of Gothic Greek temples, and also there is an Hibernian Hall near here, interestingly, but Mills was just designing all of these homes for the elites of Charleston, they tell us. He was also responsible for the fireproof building and the lunatic asylums. Which, again, you'll see these stories that the buildings were destroyed and then rebuilt, and then they show you an old photo, but honestly, all these buildings were very similar, and so the asylum is very close to the fireproof building. You see these massive brick buildings, right, with these lower arches showing that there's a bottom floor, but then you have these stairs that are going up to the second level. Now, for some reason, everyone seems to think that this is normal. Come to find out, when you go in, there's a lower level actually that goes down several feet, and the doors are tiny on the bottom level, or the windows are going right below street level, indicating that these buildings are going underground a little bit. And then there was some type of renovation process in which they built these stairs to make the second floor the first floor, and the bottom floor some type of half basement, which I believe there are even lower levels, but we'll talk about that soon. We're going to be seeing many buildings in this presentation, so we're going to have to move on from Robert Mills for now. But the idea or point is that most of these architectures are credited to being designed by these elite trained architects that for some reason had an obsession with Greek revival, yet they didn't practice their cleanliness and philosophies practically in their day-to-day lives. This is all coming from someone who is doubtful of the mainstream narrative. If one were to visit with these questions in mind, and to have some kind of foundation to start looking at the city through new eyes, would we be able to start to see that these stories that they tell us are not really adding up? Well, before we get to the juice section, I mean, this whole video is flooded with info, but there's so much more to cover. First, did you know that there was a World Fair in Charleston? The South Carolina Interstate and West Indian Exposition, or the West Indian Exposition, was held in Charleston in 1901. Literally, in just 1 year, they built all of this. Again, it's the same story in every city. They built all these fairs in such a short time period because it was made from wood and plaster. Okay, so use your head for a second. Look at this aerial shot of the fair, okay? You really think that the people of Charleston can build this in a single year? Let me see them do that today with modern machinery, then I'll believe it. We're talking over 250 acres. They're saying it would have been over 3 million feet of lumber to create these great palaces and grand buildings that had the alabaster finish, giving it the nickname of the Ivory City. Why does that sound familiar? Check out this old footage and panoramic of the fair. This doesn't look temporary to me, but I'll let you decide for yourself. Now, I heard an argument saying, well, what about these sculptures, right? Because some of these sculptures had symbolism referencing the Civil War or other historical events, but these statues could have just been added later during the renovation process. This isn't really something that we can analyze because, of course, right after the fair, they decided to take down all these buildings because they went bankrupt. Right, how convenient. If they truly built these structures, then why wouldn't they just keep them up to show them off and continually make a profit off them? But for some reason, no, they destroyed them. Is it because there's something else going on? Then we have these different asylums like the orphan asylum in Charleston. You think the story is any different here? They flooded these cities with mind-controlled orphans so that they could propagate their propaganda without being questioned. Then, you would have lower-class citizens who would be forced to work in these mills, which are all over the South and they are massive. Trust me, we've been to many, and these are no joke. We're talking millions of bricks. And we actually got drone footage of one of the biggest that I've ever seen. So now we move on to resets because, as I was just talking about with the orphans, there were certain cataclysmic events that essentially made the city restart, and they would wipe it clean and repopulate it with newly brought in orphans. Now, this is of course after these wealthy families came in, renovated, and slapped their names on everything and presented their planned history, but this was crucial in setting up their new world. No one could know of the past in our history, so it was wiped clean, and the people responsible for this were Oddfellows and all their Freemasonic brothers who were both white and black. The Oddfellows' purpose were to educate the orphan, and they're the ones behind many of these orphan asylums and education programs for every local city. For example, there's an emblem throughout the city that says Carolopolis. What are we looking at? Is this Phoenician etymology? And it's showing a massive city in the skyline with the date of 1670. I actually never heard of this word, I just saw it on the street and it caught my attention. Come to find out that this is a big clue. I believe that this is a leftover symbol from the Brotherhood, but I'll cover this more later when we come back to our trip because there's a lot to say. So one of the craziest things that I learned about Charleston is the sheer amount of damage that happened after the Civil War, they say, and that before, there were even multiple great fires and earthquakes. So some serious crazy shit went down here, and people are willing to accept that, but many people are not really curious as whether or not there is something else going on with all of these catastrophic events. So these are the pictures of after the Civil War in Charleston, and just look at how much damage this is. So there were even more buildings than there are now? I just look at these photos and truly wonder how much was lost and or how was this even possible? It looks very similar to firebombing in Japan, so was this purposely done to destroy many old buildings? And what's with all these great fires in every city? I mean, come on, I thought they were intellectuals, you know? Why do they keep messing up this bad? but they tell us that there have been conflagrations or con flags, red flags, that have occurred in Charleston since 1740, again in 1778, 1838, and then of course the Great Fire of 1861. Many rumors spread thinking it must have been a slave or a Union siege, yet they say that they rediscovered the answer because they found this one guy's journal saying that they just didn't have enough water supplies. Okay, yeah, but how did the fire get started? So, they come in 1863, shelled the city, and oh yeah, they had plenty of times to take pictures of the destruction, in HD, ruins of cathedrals, yet they didn't have time to actually take pictures of the event itself. Interesting. There's also this photo of a 9-story building in Charleston. That means that this was built sometime prior to 1865, and it looks mud flooded as hell. I mean, is this supposed to be another mill? If this is a mill, this would have been one of the largest for its time. There are so many questions to be asked on whether this had elevators, was it an apartment, how did they manage waste, how did they move water around, how much water pressure would that require? Well, supposedly this was the largest building in the United States at that time, and this would have been the true first skyscraper, but there's no info on it, and look how tiny these men are in the photo. Weirdly enough, another website is showing this photo, but it labels it as Richmond, Virginia after the Civil War in 1865, which it looks very similar. Also, the ruins of Huxall's Mills, which all look to be the same building. I mentioned this earlier on how they had all these lookalikes and they would use these old photographs to explain multiple buildings, and there's also many stories of this building used to be there and then they rebuilt it and then they moved it after the Civil War, and it's just strange. The question is, were the photos showing the destruction after 1865 due to 2 years of Union bombardment, or was it due to the fire of 1861? Which, fire isn't just going to make buildings disappear. And this is important because this all revolves around this circular church that they claim they built in 1806. It's actually much older, but we went there on tour and we actually were in the graveyard in the middle of the night, so we'll talk about that soon. From the Charleston Daily Courier, May 23rd, 1806, we're left with this article that seems to be the only proof, along with the Great Fire destruction photograph, for the claim that they built this structure. Yet, if we look at this photograph that they say used to be the circular church, it's a completely different building. This church was preceded by an older church, at least from 1681, a meeting house in the same exact address, which Wiki again uses the same exact photo to reference this older church. But the records of this early 17th century church was lost in, quote, the worst typhoon in coastal history, end quote. This brings us to great earthquakes and hurricanes, as not only were there great fires, but the biggest earthquake in Atlantic coastal history, and this is 1886. They're saying that this earthquake nearly destroyed all of Charleston. This event destroyed even more buildings, so wait, now there's this new great disaster. According to the Abbeville Press in 1886, Charleston nearly ruined by an earthquake. So the local news is on this, huh? But wait, there's more. Fissures in the earth emit sand, blue mud, and sulfuric odor. Wait, blue mud? They're speaking of mud volcanoes. Yeah, that's right. Fissures in the earth that would emit blue mud. And this is exactly what happens in the 10 active mud volcanoes in the Mariana Forearc. The material erupted in these mud volcanoes consist primarily of blue and green mud. Take note of this for later. The next part of the news says that only one store is open, but even more, it says that 20 miles of the Charleston and Savannah Railroad are now underwater. There's this painting in the South Carolina State Museum called People Running the Night of the Earthquake, which is from 1886, interestingly, and it looks like all these people are running from this dust cloud. But could it be something else? Seems that this could have been a mass release of gases that in turn killed a large percentage of the population. This brings us to brimstone, which is referenced in many ancient religions as being punishment, which would basically be sulfur in the sky giving this acidic odor of sulfur dioxide, but this connects with earthquakes and volcanoes as these gases are released during these events. Check this out. Quote, a shower of brimstone. Charleston has had her earthquake, followed by a shower of pebbles, and now Columbia follows with somewhat a familiar phenomena. Wait, so this is happening basically in every city? With the exception of the pebbles, there was another sulfuric event in Columbia. It is followed by a story of a colored man named Henry Jones who found these small yellow pebbles on his yard. His wife discovered that when she touched the yellow pebbles with their iron, that it ignited and burned. So these pebbles were falling from the sky and they were flammable. It continues to say that a reporter came to investigate and found it to be sulfur. It emitted a bluish light and the fumes were sulfurous. The next matter to investigate was where did it come from, but all the locals and occupants of the house said that it rained down from the sky. Is this connecting with Book of the Damned by Charles Fort? But listen to this. The next part of the article mentions that it's possible that this came from a meteor that was in the sky at the exact time as the earthquake. So if you've seen our Great Lakes video, we know that comets are usually visible during great events of destruction. So I find it interesting that they even brought this up. But when it comes to the Great Fire of Charleston, the issue is that there are a majority of websites and museums that claim that the vast majority of Charleston was destroyed in the Great Fire of 1861, not the Civil War. It was the worst fire in history. Somehow it burned a third of the city, yet entire blocks were reduced to complete rubble. This brings us to Great Reset events that are not locally known by any of the local historians or tour guides, it seems, as many of us are brought up to believe that volcanoes were only on the west coast. And so if you type in, are there volcanoes on the east coast? Google will tell you that it's been millions of years since there were volcanoes on the east coast. But that's not true. There are definitely active volcanoes on the east coast, and interestingly, this is connected with earthquakes, hurricanes, and not only that, tsunamis and typhoons. There's evidence that a volcano went off near Charleston around this time. So from this fire and earthquake, we have the loss of millions. Everything burnt to ash, they say, yet some random fire did this. Or is there a reason that multiple articles from this time period reference, quote, an examination of the Earth's surface at Charleston and its vicinity reveals many phenomena. At Mount Pleasant, opposite Charleston, a hollow, which Tuesday was perfectly dry and is now full of fresh water. A cabin occupied by yawning chasms extended through the Earth's surface 10 feet and over. All around this are sinks of fresh water and masses of mud with green-looking soft substances never seen before. It is contended by many that the mud and other substances found around the village are volcanic matter. Just after the first shock on Tuesday night, there was a distinct smell of escaping sulfuric acid gas over the entire village. The smell lasted throughout the night." End quote. In St. Paul's Globe, there's another reference to the volcano. Quote, "The volcanic eruption at Charleston confirms the theory that the earthquake is only the chimney builder who creates vent apertures for the fiery torrents which slumber in the bosom of old Mother Earth, and which now then becomes too hot to be held within their confines." End quote. Whoa, so they won't teach you that in school. And there's even more evidence for this volcano. From the Chattanooga Daily Times, 1886, quote, "Near Shell Street, there's a cabin occupied by a colored man that is completely surrounded by yawning chasms extending through the earth." They mean it's just a giant open sinkhole basically. and extending through the earth at a surface for 10 feet and over. All around this there are sinks of fresh water and mud with queer looking soft substances. So again, these are mud volcanoes, and we'll come back to this when it comes to mud flood. Quote, "It is contended by many that the mud and other substances found around the village are volcanic matter." End quote. Quote, "It was distinct in those localities where the cavities in the earth were most numerous. Some say that portions of the mud thrown up by the waterspouts are strongly impregnated with sulfur, and that small portions of sulfur can be found in the mud not far from Charleston." But listen to this. "The matter that was thrown up was of a dark, slity color and was mixed with gravel." And they're also telling you that there were fissures everywhere. So hold up. Is this an explanation of where the mud actually came from and why these buildings sunk down a little bit? There's also an indication that a volcano was sighted by a lighthouse in 1886. From the Parsons Daily Sun, a strange column resembling a volcano seen 20 miles from Hilton Headlight. Is it a volcano or only a ship of fire? I'm not going to read the entire article because we have a lot to cover, but I'll slowly pan it so that you can read it here. I find it interesting that you can find all these references to volcanoes. Seems that there could have possibly been an underwater volcano. Which reminds me, there was this recent viral video that came out showing this massive red glow from the sky that was recorded and posted by a pilot. Well, this went viral and people had all sorts of theories calling it Stranger Things and stuff, but one of the theories I found interesting is that people were saying it was an underwater volcano. If you watch the news cover up for this, I'll leave it in the description because they'd probably strike us for showing it, but they get this expert to come on and say that he's 100% positive that he knows the explanation, and then goes on to say that it's a bunch of boats with red lights because they're using it to catch fish. Yet, people easily debunk this in the comments because that would require ships lined up for miles. Watch the video and you'll see what I mean, but yeah, who's to say that there are not volcanoes involved with the destruction of Charleston? Remember, we're not even considering all the disease events. I mean, Charleston had its own great stink too. They had to flush out the entire waste system because it was causing cholera. It's the same story in every city. Interestingly, there was the Great Cyclone of 1885 that devastated Charleston, but it destroyed 90% of buildings. Okay, so this is like the third time that they said this, that an event has completely destroyed the city. And actually it's probably more because they do the same thing with disease. Wait, so we have 1861, Great Fire, then we have the Civil War, then we have the Great Typhoon in 1885, then we have the Great Earthquake in 1886. There's an active volcano in South Carolina. Remember the battle on King Mountain? Well, that's right, King Mountain is an active volcano, which weirdly is in Blacksburg. I'm just saying, few people know about that. And sure, it's 3 hours away, but what other volcanoes are we not aware of? It's just very strange that a battle in the Revolutionary War took place here. This gets us into mud volcanoes that can literally come from any fissure in the earth. It seems that there's suppression when it comes to understanding what volcanoes are. Many sometimes always ask, well, where did all this mud come from? But if you consider mud volcanoes and then tie this into the mud flood subject, I mean, think about how many of these buildings really don't make any sense. I mean, literally some of them don't even have front doors, and many are halfway underground. Okay, so that was a lot, but you're still there? Because I'm really just getting started, and I'm excited for this next part because now I can tell you all about our trip and also show you some really cool footage and pictures. I don't really think I fully understood what I was in for. I mean, I grew up in the South, but never really grew up learning too much about South Carolina. All I knew was the Civil War stuff and that it was a red state really, but when I started looking into this and preparing for the trip, I really kind of thought it was a small old world city with a bunch of lost architecture, but I really had no idea. I mean, it's kind of like a college party city, and they're just all walking around clueless to all this amazing old world architecture that's all around them. But anyways, we basically started by heading over to Columbia to go to the state library so that we could get a bunch of books on this subject, and so we explored Columbia. But actually right before that, and I almost forgot to mention, so on the map I noticed this huge lake, and come to find out it was a man-made lake, so it seemed fishy. So we come here on the way to Columbia, and we actually find out that this place has some crazy secrets. I pull up, I try to get some drone footage, and they basically tell me that they would have thrown me in jail for it, but they were so serious about this place. Which I can kind of understand. I mean, they don't want these drones going into the dam. But towards the end of the video, I'm going to tell you some mind-blowing stuff about this place. So let's just start off with some brief similarities of Columbia. They say that Columbia wasn't really started until 1786, yet many of these names are just Venetian-owned corporations, being that Columbia is named after Columbus. So, the commissioners comprised the local government until 1797, when a commission of streets and markets was created by the General Assembly. Three main issues occupied their time: public drunkenness, gambling, and poor sanitation. But yeah, you have these same French chateaus and these huge governmental buildings, which I'm kind of really excited because I'm still learning, but I got all this footage myself with the drone and it was super crazy. Felt like I was flying, but yeah, we got super close to the buildings and we could look over the entire city. I actually flew so far off this one time that I almost lost it, but yeah, no, we're good. So, we're visiting the Capitol grounds and looking at this Capitol building, and there was this little green beetle, like, you know those holographic ones with the sheen or metallic reflection? And one of these landed on Moon and stayed with us for like hours, and it's just really weird. And we went to go get food and everything, and it was there until we got to this bridge area, and then the beetle flew away right when Moon thought in her mind that this would be the perfect place for him. And then as soon as she thought that, the beetle flew away, and I don't know, I just kind of saw it as a sign because the beetle was also an ancient symbol for luck, so perhaps this was a blessing. There are many buildings here that are all very extravagant, and some were destroyed, but there wasn't even 1,000 people here in 1800, so in 1816 there were only 250 homes, and then they finally got over 1,000 people. So this is referenced again in the New York Times, but there was a fire of great destruction in Columbia in 1865, but this time it actually was the Union that set it on fire and completely destroyed it. This was one of the most cruel things ever done to a US city. They came in, robbed, ravaged, and commit 3/5 of the city into flames. Okay, so this is from William Gilmore Simms' 1865 pamphlet, The Sack and Destruction of the City of Columbia, South Carolina, which actually appeared in the Columbia Phoenix publication, weirdly. He calls this building ancient, but then he goes on to say that it was built 70 years earlier, which this is where we get the construction date. And I don't know if I believe this whole story. Why would you call it ancient if it was just 70 years old? Maybe that's a clue? There was also a huge earthquake in Columbia as well, so this seems to have happened everywhere along with these sulfuric outbursts. Oh, and Olympia Mills? Okay, so this is pretty crazy. This has to be the biggest mill that I've ever seen so far because there's two of them back to back, and this one still has the towers on it, which you can see has an old world clock. We also went inside of this place and it was super creepy, but yeah, this looks to be like a super old world building to me, and Look at these old photos. They say that the population of Colombia in 1880 had just exceeded 10,000, but still, in these old photos, there are literally no people and it looks very old. Colombia didn't even have paved streets until 1908, yet they were building these massive mills for nobody. Also, there were a lot of capitals and libraries, universities, with this Columbia or Columbus name. I found it interesting that this is the coat of arms for Columbia University in New York. So, this isn't a South Carolina unveiled. That would be a huge endeavor, but we'll have to come back to Columbia for another video. As soon as we were leaving, the same spot where Moon left the Beetle, where the bridge was, and I got some cool footage of it and I was reading the history on it. Come to find out, it is based on an even older bridge that was once there. So, the base structure is an old world artifact. It truly is a beautiful bridge, and I really love this area because it was just super peaceful and just the weather was nice. It was kind of windy, but it was perfect for flying. So, we were walking around here, and right under this bridge, you can see that there are these huge boulders that were supporting the entire foundation of this bridge, and this wasn't on the water, but on the land. This reminded me of many other foundations that I've seen like this with Paris Mountain, but these were even bigger. I took many photos, but it's kind of hard to get the scale unless you look in person. Just face the opposite direction of the river when you're under the bridge, and just look at the rock face. You'll see evidence of massive boulders. Okay, so we're finally to Charleston. Man, I don't know how to put this. Charleston was just insane, and I honestly don't feel I can express how crazy this place really is until you just go down there and walk around. I mean, this has to be not only the oldest city, but the most old world architectures that I've ever seen in a city in the South, like in the downtown area. It just goes on and on, it's non-stop. And I mean, okay, it's not New York, but if you stayed up at night and just walk around town, this place feels and smells like New York. It'll just give you a similar vibe, which is really weird for the South. So we get here and we just start walking around downtown, and I'm gonna be breaking down the main streets, but basically we were right by Mating and King, and King was kind of the first street that we started with, so let's just go with that. King Street is over 300 years old, and it is the second most significant street in downtown Charleston. This is named after King Charles himself. Strangely, it was also known as the Broad Path, the Broad Road, the Highway, because it was located on high ground. They say that this was the primary road for entering and exiting the city. And keep in mind that just because these are painted over buildings or they have a thin wall of plaster on top, does not mean that these are modern. They have gone through renovation. So these buildings have been renovated for the last 100 years or more, and they're still doing it till this day. So I stayed up late and got this awesome footage of the area from both drone and walking perspectives. So that's the thing, that Charleston does go to sleep, but I don't know, it's just kind of strange to describe the feeling of walking among all these buildings while no one else is around. What you'll see is that almost all these old world buildings have been converted into commercial shops. Even buildings that look like castles or Roman temples. They're owned by big corporations that sell here. But the weird thing is that this is not just the downtown buildings, this is literally the entirety of Charleston. They just buy these old world buildings and keep reselling them, which I believe is a huge factor on why we have lost their history, because they've gone through so many different owners. Now, it was during this time that we saw the sewers with the secret Masonic emblem referencing Carolopolis. Well, after seeing that, we definitely thought it was weird. And then the next morning, when we got our bikes and we started exploring, we made it to the College of Charleston, which supposedly is the oldest municipal college in the United States. Again, you see the lower level underground and the stairs that go to the second level. This was confirmed once we walked in the building. It went down at least 6 feet, but I wouldn't be surprised if it goes more. All they had to do was fill it in. Well, these colleges are open door, and so you can walk in, and so we go to the top floor where they're giving classes, which there's like one student there, and I honestly think it was just the teacher talking to herself, I'm not even kidding, but you go in there and you immediately see that they have this obsession with the Romans and Greeks. Also, they had these boards where they put up people's work and stuff, and they literally had memes on how they were teaching history. This is how they teach our next generation now. So, we were exploring and there was an empty classroom with a bunch of old Greek books. Probably just a bunch of copies, but regardless, they all had this weird emblem at the beginning. And it was another logo similar to Keralopolis, but this was a different emblem. This one's even weirder. It's a giant woman, possibly Athena or Statue of Liberty, that is literally a Phoenician giant anointing what seems to be this brotherhood. Every single one of these books have this. And then I had this strange sensation where I remembered this anime Promised Neverland, and they have these same exact things where these orphans who were a bunch of slaves to a system which they were food or energy, and so they were given clues by some type of secret society in their books in the library, and in that case it was an emblem of an owl, but still it just makes you think that these secret societies leave symbols behind for their initiates. Come to find out that as I was exploring, you'll see this emblem literally on every historic building. This is their stamp. This is what puts these buildings on the historic record. I was looking at one and some lady came up to me and was like, "Oh, you know what that means? It's basically a code of laws that made it so all the architecture in Charleston had to follow certain regulations, all the way up to the materials used in construction, so that all of the city had a similar style." She smirked at me as if she was 100% certain, and she said, "Isn't that neat?" And I'm just thinking like, who's this chick? Come to find out, she's one of the historians at the museum, and she saw me looking at it. And most of these people that work here are like in their mid-20s. So like, they just graduated and they're taking over these exhibits now, and they work there and they talk to the locals basically. It was the same thing for the Fireproof Building or the State History Museum. So yeah, there's also a lot of cool alleyways in Charleston with these weird deformed paths that you can explore, but they're really beautiful in many ways. There are also buildings that have strange text and unique styles out of nowhere. I saw this one building that has another date that seems to look like a J to me. Sure, it's stylistic, but the one is different on the right side, so the first and last character are different. Also, look at the Urban Outfitters, which weirdly, there are some things that they're covering up. It looks like it's very fragile, but it seems to be a coat of arms because I've seen this where they take the coat of arms off the building that was added during the original renovation process. There's a lot of old buildings on this King Street, and this is not even the whole thing. And most of them are just stores now. But yeah, there's also evidence of destroyed buildings that were once connected but no longer connected. So you're seeing inner walls. And so we're riding around, visiting the college. It was an amazing, beautiful day. All these gardens and trees, and I'm telling you, nothing like going around exploring old world buildings, but they have houses that are all around the college that are old world buildings, and even college kids live in these. You'll see these in many of the houses where there's no front door. They add the door on the side later, and the porches of the house are on the side of the house. But that doesn't really make sense. What, do you want to look at your neighbor's wall? Especially with this whole idea of being an open door culture, right? They say that they did this to have their doors open. Well, why wouldn't you just do this on the front of the house? The funny thing about that is that I knew there was something up with the doors, but I never really thought about it that way until we were actually sitting on one and someone mentioned it, and we all kind of sat back and were like, yeah, that is kind of weird. But that's something you'll see in Charleston is that many of these houses have the door to the side of the house and then it goes onto the porch and then you enter from the side and it's slightly lifted. So yeah, then we made our way to Pitt Street, which really isn't all that famous of a street, but there's a lot of evidence for mud-flooded buildings there. Before that, here's the Cameron's house and the emblem that I was talking about when we were talking about these historic buildings. And if you just walk around these houses, you can see evidence that there is a lower floor that goes underground. I honestly don't know what I was thinking, but we were riding around here, and so I walk around to this abandoned kindergarten. And man, let me tell you, this place gave me the creeps. I was hearing kid laughs in my mind, and I was just looking at these dilapidated seesaws and swings, and it just gave me bad vibes. Many of the older houses of Charleston have a similar brick style, and you can actually see that with the case here. There are some bottom window compartments, or what they call crawling chambers. I don't know why they say this, but yeah, no front door. And would you look at what we stumbled upon here? A construction project? So we're walking around and literally you can see the process with your eyes. There's no construction involved. They take an old world building, plaster it up, add a new roof, give it some paint, maybe destroy some of the interiors to build your own design from cheap materials, and then bam, you have yourself a new world building. They have some wooden houses, but again, there's evidence that they just built over an existing structure. We'll come back to talk about more buildings, but I'm just going to go linear with this experience. So around this area is a Gilded Age looking mansion called the Wentworth Mansion, and it's pretty insane. We did a walk around and we looked for evidence of lower levels, and you could see it in multiple areas. It would have been cool if we could explore it inside, but they really wouldn't let us. And I mean, just imagine, you're riding your bike and we didn't really know about this place and we just stumbled upon it. And like I said, there's just so much architecture in Charleston, but this one is definitely probably one of the craziest that I saw. Another big mill in Charleston is the cigar mill, which when driving around looked just like all these other mills. Then, once you first visit Charleston, you gotta go to Fort Sumter. The ticket place is an old world building, and there's a museum inside too. But yeah, you take a ferry, and it's about a 30-minute ride, and you get this professional movie voice that comes on, and it just explains all the history. But essentially, there were 4 main ones that they talk about: Castle Pinckney, Fort Johnson, Fort Moultrie, and Fort Sumter. Castle Pinckney was completed in 1812. Fort Johnson was one of the oldest and original forts from the British settlements. So remember, the whole narrative is that the United States built these for the Civil War. Yet the British colonies had them and they said that this was for the Spanish, and on top of that, original Charleston was completely fortified. They seem to not want to mention any of these early forts or that Charleston was completely fortified in this Fort Sumter Museum at all, because there's a bunch of forts that they don't mention. Early forts such as Grantsville Bastion, which is really just a corner of a massive star fort structure. They're separating Civil War forts and early bastions because if one were to truly realize the immensity of these structures and the resources required, some serious questions might start to be raised. So, you start to get close, and the ride was actually super nice, it was relaxing, and even though it was plastic chairs, it really wasn't that bad. I did get some early drone footage from the sky, but you can't really do that in national parks anymore, they're just super weird about it. But if you look, you can see that they added this concrete on the outside and that they bricked it up in the inside. It's almost as if the inner brick is untouched and the outer brick was once painted white, and some of these metal frames had these dents on them, so they could have really been shooting cannonballs, but I don't think it was at ships. It was used for destruction. You can actually see how much was destroyed, and they kind of block stuff out because these cannons are falling apart and they didn't really want people climbing on them, but all these cannons seem new and not really originals to me. Now, you really need to consider this. There's only a certain amount of rotation allowed with such a small opening, literally less than 30 degrees. Now, they tell us that they had great precision with these things, so much so that they could defend this by hitting ships on the water. Obviously, that sounds incredibly difficult if we imagine them hitting the ship directly. So, the story goes that these bounced off the water and hit the boats. Now, that's not always the story because they had a variety of cannons that just shot straight up in the air, so we know those had a very low precision rate. Yet, they tell us that they just shot these for days on end, I guess just hoping that they'd hit their target. There's this article that talks about how the Mythbusters actually attempted to see if it was really possible to do this. And I don't really know if I buy all this because it was even on the news and everything. So basically they were doing this test with cannonballs, and this wasn't even on water or anything. They were literally just shooting at a wall. There's a video on it called Mythbusters' Worst Day Ever. They're in the middle of nowhere in the desert, and somehow or another, no one knows, a cannon went through the neighborhood, and then they say somehow it bounced and went through a house and hit a minivan. They literally said that they were at a bomb range and that they were prepared for this. So how could this just have accidentally happened? The show never aired, but this is a common question that is asked. Is it truly possible to bounce cannonballs off the water? Most historians would scoff and say yes, but there are some serious questions to be asked on how precise this was. There are no videos that I have seen that shows this process of bouncing on water and hitting a target, especially from multiple miles away. All I see are models that are very inaccurate and are only used on land to hit pretty close range targets. They literally tell us that they could use these cannons to hit ships from 2 to 3 miles away. Okay, show me a video of someone just doing that on land. It's not an easy feat, especially if you're considering a moving target, wind, and a number of other variables such as these small windows that they say they shot these cannons out of. So you couldn't really aim them up, you were gonna have to aim them down, and it had to be at a precise angle. But sometimes it took multiple people to work these cannons, and you gotta think, they're doing this hours on end. This is the story they want us to believe, that this was some type of defense fort that was used during the Civil War. But if we look at its early depictions, it seems that it looked like something much greater. I mean, the entire island is man-made, they said. Looks to me to be an old government building that probably sat on just one corner of an even greater, more massive star fort surrounding all of Charleston, similar to other European cities such as Amsterdam and London. So, they destroyed it, brought it to ruins, and then they say that these windows are the way that they came in, used the cannons, yet some of these you can see strange formations, almost ornamental, that were not quite burned away or something. But yeah, they say they bricked up these windows later, but why? Also, there is this submarine thing called the Hunley, which is also weird, like this primitive submarine, which they say was one of the first ones. But I wonder if it's just more propaganda stuff. I mean, it disappeared because it was drowned by the inventor and then it reappeared. It also had this strange spear stabbing device, and I'm not really sure about all that because I believe that they had underwater tech for far longer than they tell us. They also had floating mines that they say were just barrels of powder. But look at this. Fort Wagner, a Confederate stronghold near Morris Island's north end, was attacked by the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, a black regiment, which we see in this painting an entire army of blacks who were fighting for the Union, they tell us, and they end up failing taking the fort, but it just seemed very interesting. Here's where they show you what they say is Meeting Street and the circular church at Fort Sumter Museum. Again, they want you to see this photo of destruction so that you think they rebuilt everything. Fort Johnson was completely destroyed, but this is what they say, that it was in the hands of the colonials, who were the British and all these other German Protestant bloodlines, and then they tell us that the British forces found it abandoned in 1780 during the American Revolution. Okay, another massive fort that was lost. So yeah, Fort Sumter is where it all began, and they used cannons to destroy these structures, which I can find believable. But in terms of using them as defense, I don't see much evidence for that. You see, that is what they're labeled to be, America's coastal defenses. This whole idea that after the War of 1812, and there's that date again, these structures were being built to protect the coast of the United States. Then they tell us that President James Madison led a government survey on all these fortifications, and it recommended that a new fort be built on Charleston's harbor. Why is there no mention that these forts have been here since Charleston's founding? I'm literally showing you the diagram from the Fort Sumter Museum itself. It says that it's in the ruins of the fort. So you really can't go any more to the source than this. They even have the audacity to throw in a painting that shows the whole town completely fortified. Now, here we come to the start of the Civil War, where they show you this flag. Remember, we learned about this, and every local knows this story, but we're about to see where these symbols truly come from. They show you the base structure and say that 70,000 tons of granite was used to create this fort. So they had to bring all this from the north, they tell us, and I don't think that's going to be an easy task at all. They had many of these forts. I'm not even mentioning the possibility that there may be lower levels here, because I've been to other forts, and as I've mentioned with Fort Pickens in Pensacola, there's evidence that it goes deeper, that the arches are actually double arches vertically and mirror each other, so they're really these large ovals or circles. But you can see they filled up the floor at Fort Sumter, so you can't really observe whether that is the case, but it seems possible if you look at some of these arches where the cannons are, and even older photos, you can see that something is definitely underneath. Then we get to this whole Union dissolving, and weird how it's called the Charleston Mercury. Mercury poisoning is known to make people go mad and insane, so perhaps this is what they wanted. Then we get a nice portrait of Abe Lincoln's brother, Jefferson Davis, the leader of the Southern Republic. And then you also have his wife, and this image seems to be extremely touched up. Then we have the early depiction of Charleston, that they're showing these armies, right? They're trying to take back these forts, and for Fort Moultrie, you can see that this was some type of factory plant. But even weirder, you can see that their flags contain the snake, the Richland Volunteer Rifle Company. And if you don't know, the Richland Lodge in Columbia goes all the way back to before the War of 1812. There definitely seems to be a connection, since this company too was started in South Carolina. Then they tell us about this military state college, which looks to be a castle to me. And they have different ones, the old Citadel and the newer one. I guess it's just been through more renovation, but they still both look like castles. So I'll just go ahead and finish this up with Fort Sumter in the Civil War. Basically, the Confederates had these outfits, and they basically looked like pirates. So they had this cross and X on their hats. Now this is a very important symbol, as it is the exact same symbol used for Skull and Bones, which is another fraternity secret society started at Yale University in 1832, 30 years before the Civil War. Come to find out that multiple Confederate generals and state senators were high-ranking members in this club. There's a long list showing you all the prominent members of society. The Skull and Bones has always been known as a pirate symbol, so this isn't new. They chose that symbol on purpose. Even the personal private secretary to Jefferson Davis, Burton Norvell Harrison, was a member of the Skull and Bones. Not only that, the eagle is very reminiscent of all the bird symbols of power used on royal crescents. The eagle and phoenix, you don't think they're connected? Obviously, this just means the United States, but we're going to be questioning all these symbols and where they came from. For example, the symbol of the snake, not only was it the symbol of South Carolina, but the Southern Republic. They never really explain why. They tell us about the plan to strangle the South, but why is there a snake around this palmetto? Why the palmetto? And what's the crescent? Is there a reason that we can find old flags with upside down pentagrams on it? Why is it when you look into palmetto trees on coat of arms that you actually find this ancient symbol goes back to royal bloodlines? I'm not over abusing this point. You explain to me why there are heraldry from over 300 years ago depicting a black phoenix with a palmetto tree and two cobras on each side. This was actually in the fireproof building too, where the State Museum is. They had this painting of a snake on the palmetto and it says built from the ruins. Still think that this is not a phoenix? Even though that this is literally what we see in many early engravings. The same supposed eagle, but it's on fire. This palmetto symbol is not original to South Carolina. It is on many hundreds of different coat of arms, with lions, headless knights, Moors, and most interestingly, the country flag of the Maldives. It's the exact same thing, right? But they're telling you the original symbol. Not only were the Huguenots in America, but they went out to settle multiple different areas in the world. Quote, the Huguenots held their services behind the curtains of secrecy, most commonly in the dead of night. Some historians believe that the clandestine operation could be related to the origin of their name, Le Roi Huguet, meaning King Huguet, referred to purgatory spirits who'd haunted the living at night. Their presence eventually caught the eye of a pallid-faced Venetian ambassador who purportedly warned his Catholic superiors that 3/4 of France was contaminated with his heretical doctrine. The Huguenots' burgeoning power and alleged attempts to infiltrate the world of politics soon alarmed the French authorities. They suspected that these Huguenots were low-profile Republicans involved in a terrible conspiracy to conjure up an uprising to overthrow the monarchy and rebrand France as a federal state. The royal government of France would attempt to tread lightly in the beginning, keeping their hands clean on neutral grounds, but a nightmare was really about to unfold. In the 1560s, French authorities called for the violent and bloody persecution of all Huguenots. This hostile period of 36 years fraught with conflict, upheaval, and civil vendettas between the Huguenots and the Catholics is known as the quote, French Wars of Religion, or simply the Huguenot Wars. Quote, the Huguenots were known iconoclasts who rejected statues, paintings, idols, and other religious images, as often seen in the numerous statues and stained glass artworks in Catholic churches. Across Europe, rebellious Protestants seized Catholic churches and swiped all heretical images, destroying them with axes and hurling them into roaring bonfires. End quote. So yeah, people don't seem to question the crescent, but now that we know about the Sephardic Jews and also the French Huguenots, that we know for a fact were one of the early Protestant colonizers of Charleston, who were descended from the Arabic Moorish Empire. This makes far more sense, and I know many people who have thought that this symbol looks exactly like that, right? Because I know some Christians who refuse to even come here because it seems that it has a resemblance to the Islamic crescent. To prove this, we're going to take a look at this book called The History and Conquest of Spain by Arab Moors. And so this has some really interesting secret Moorish history. On page 445, it talks about Christopher Columbus and the true meaning of his name, and how instead of bringing light, he only brought evil from Spain onto the Aborigines. Now wait, because this is when it gets interesting. It says that this was only propaganda because what he dispensed, being Columbus of the Moorish civilization, was only good. The inventions and discoveries that they had introduced. His vessel was fitted out in that little port of Palos, which had lately been a Moorish port. Now listen closely. His sailors were, many of them, men with Moorish blood in their veins. It has been asserted that when the Moors were driven out, he's talking about Spain, then they took refuge in France, who afterwards, abhorring the Roman Catholic persecutions, became the Huguenots, and that many immigrated at a later day to South Carolina, end quote. So they're basically saying that Columbus, the Spaniards, the French were mulattoes and Moors, just as Benjamin Franklin mentioned, and that one of these French Protestant families were actually Moorish in origin and one of the founders of South Carolina. The Moors were known to be Muslims during this time, and so obviously this makes sense on why there's a crescent there. They took the star out just so that it wouldn't be even more blatantly obvious than it already is. But they actually do have flags with the star. Some of the first ones contain this star, which is a pentagram. There's more to cover, like the fort being built by slaves and this idea that these cannons would just explode. Some more ruins of all the dirt that was left over after its destruction. And then at Fort Sumter, they show this picture of what it used to look like. So wait, this is Fort Sumter? And I guess this was before it was destroyed in the Civil War. As you can see, it has several layers above ground. And I'm thinking, so is this even the same structure? Just look at this and what it is today. And they really don't explain it. They do this with a lot of buildings and people just accept it. So yeah, we went over the Black Confederates who were forced into battle, and they were forced into battle for the Union as well, so we're told. And then they tell us that this whole Fort Sumter was used during World War II, and that literally it had to be dug out as if it was some ancient site. And then in 1961, they finally completed the renovation of the structure, which looks vastly different from the original photographs from the Civil War. So we make our way back to the ticket building, and I had to go get some more propaganda from the gift shop. You know, that's a must when you go to any of these places. You gotta go to the bookstore and read all the books and just look at the information with new eyes. Learn the main names of the story, learn their bios, and interesting things will pop up. For example, like this one book that speaks about how the slaves were forced into participating in the war, and the Native Americans as well. So they have these like kid books that talk about these early natives, but make no mention to advanced Moorish cultures. And when we go to the main room and look at all the early depictions of Charleston, they say that the majority of white settlers were in all these elite positions, and that all the black people were in slave positions. Now hold up, you're telling me this is the best that historians can do? Furthermore, the only black figures shown here are the ones who worked for the state. They're presenting a very specific narrative. And they have this whole blacks are descendant from the low country folk who were imported in from Africa, and they were just poor and ignorant. But yeah, that's Fort Sumter for you. Go check it out, and you can decide for yourself if you think they're being fair with questioning the entire narrative. I mean, this was a military base. Of course they have a story. So, we come back and explore East Bay Street. I should also mention the Battery by the Bay, which has these short cannons, but they're really just statues. And this is another common place that people will go to when they first come to Charleston. For me, I just liked exploring down East Bay Street, and this is where the Exchange building was. And this is actually where I was telling you about that historian lady that was telling me about this emblem that they use on all these historic buildings, which I think is something else. This is the symbol for the process of passing along old world buildings to the next generation, at least in my eyes. There's also a dungeon, or in other words, a lower section to this building where they kept prisoners, but people are too distracted by pirates to even consider that. So I'm walking around and I get lost on Broad Street, which here's the People building and it has 2 lions in front. There's lions everywhere here. And then you have this old world skyscraper, a castle looking building, and I did manage to get some drone footage of this area, but I'm not gonna lie, it was kind of hard. It started getting more windy, and then you also have to think you have to land it in like an alley, or there's just a lot of people, so it's hard to land. But still, it's kind of cool to be able to see it from this angle. And just think about it, I mean, all these buildings look to be extremely old, and also they've gone through multiple renovations where, in some cases, only the front of the building is left over. Okay, then we get to the Blind Tiger pub, and this is when the story gets even more interesting. So if you look at their front door scoreboard, it literally is the Royal Venetian Lion, but the reason I knew about this place is because I was researching some things about Charleston, and I didn't really know where they were. I was just walking around. I heard the name before, so when I saw it, I was like, oh, let me go in there, because basically, people have talked about these Prohibition tunnels, and so I'm going around asking the locals if they knew anything about it, and every time I got a different answer. So one of the bartenders told me that they only knew a little bit about it, and basically, these Prohibition tunnels go all the way from the liquor store to St. Michael's. And I was like, oh, I see. And I asked if they had any in there, but she said not that she knows of. So that was kind of my first encounter with actually asking someone about that, but I didn't really get any answers, so I kept walking around Broad Street, and I guess this is the first Broadway, but yeah, there's a lot of old buildings on the street. Yeah, many have gone through renovations, they have concrete, plaster, stucco, but you can tell that they were all built upon base structures, right? It really is just an illusion, and if you look at many of these porticos, these are just fake molds, yet the building itself is an old world brick structure, and there's evidence to suggest that they go several feet underground. Also, the trash company weirdly is called Trident Tech. But before that, this is where the Freemason building is, or where it used to be. And what do you know? The double-headed phoenix. Again, a Freemasonic and royal bloodline symbol. The Mother Supreme Council of the World? Then of course, they have the giant anointing the initiate in all these Carolina historical buildings. You see these buildings with some very interesting ornamentation. Here is another house where maybe the chimney was added later, along with the outside porch. And this wasn't on Broad Street, but I kind of thought I might mention it here. So what you have all over town is these old antique shops. Some of them have some pretty insane stuff. They're literally just filled with old world artifacts that used to be in these houses. And Moon said this really crazy story where she was in there and heard the owner talking with a customer about these light fixtures in these old houses that completely ran off of gas. And this was in his entire house. All the electricity actually ran off of gas, and he was basically complaining that his gas bill was so high. There's some really crazy stuff in these antique shops, like these andirons and old clocks. They're selling it for thousands of dollars, and it doesn't really seem like too many people come into these shops, so the owners will get pretty excited when you come in, and they actually keep the doors locked, so you really just have to knock. Moon was also looking at the stores, and inside she noticed that the arches of the building were converted into mirrors. And you'll see this in many different places. They just built with the surviving architecture. Oh yeah, and there's a haunted theater that still has a coat of arms up, I believe. But okay, let's get to some evidence of not only tunnels, but that these buildings are connected and have a lower underneath level. I took a video so you can see where it is. All throughout Broad Street, are these grates, but they're actually covered up in a bunch of different places already, so I wouldn't be surprised if by the time you go there, they're already covered up. But look closely, you can see there's this arch under this grate. And I could actually feel the air current coming from underneath here, and it wasn't mechanical or anything really. It was just a natural, slow current that was slightly warm, but you could feel a draft coming up. There's some pictures at different exposures, so you can see this is clearly a buried arch. I got a couple more videos of other grates right at this spot. And yeah, so these are what these alleys are like. You have this small door on the left, and then some type of Phoenician shell or something. And then you have another small garage or door entrance. But yeah, you keep going, and then at the end, there's this line fountain. I don't know, I just thought that was weird. But because I went down this alley, I found this grate, and then... But yeah, there are a bunch of party people, I'm telling you. But here's another grate. And in this area, you'll start noticing these quaint little homes that look extremely old. They're all over this area, and if you just look down in them, you'll see that it's still bricked and it goes down another level or two. Here's one of those quaint homes that I was talking about, and if you look in the grate, it's the same thing. I also never really mentioned anything about this wrought iron, but it's another thing about Charleston. And I think there's two kinds, the fake one and the real deal. This looks to be the real deal because there's a certain darkness and reflection to wrought iron that gives it such a unique look. They say that most of Charleston's iron gates were built by one blacksmith, which, weirdly, in many of these southern states, the blacksmiths are always literally black. The same thing happened at the Biltmore. They had the same story. So after noticing these quaint houses and their style, realizing that they were actually from before the 1700s, I started looking for more of them. And then I came across this little art gallery, which was cool, but finally I had arrived at the place I was looking for. It was one of the oldest buildings in Charleston, America's oldest liquor store, the Tavern in Charleston. Now I actually didn't really know about this building at all. I was just looking for old world buildings to research Prohibition tunnels and just stumbled upon this after walking out that alley. And this is actually really well known. It's right by Rainbow Row, so I'm not saying it's hidden or anything. I just don't know the area too well, and I was just walking around trying to see what I could find. I mean, I sorta did know about it, but still, I just walk in and talk to the counter worker. And I ask, I'm like, do you guys know anything about the Prohibition tunnels? And it's just this lady working at the counter. And she's looking at me like, and I can see she's looking behind me to this other guy. Well, come to find out that this guy knows everything about Charleston and the Prohibition tunnels. But he literally had one of the entrances to these tunnels under the building. He was the dude that owned it. And like I said, these buildings are just resold to people, and then they come down and realize that, oh, it was used for Prohibition. And they believe this simply because there were bottles down there. That's pretty much it. Something about a hidden wall. I can promise you, none of them have considered the vast majority of what we discussed, which hints to this being a city owned by a prior civilization. But anyhow, I look over to this guy, and he's like, yeah, what do you want to know? Super snobby kind of. And if I had a store like this and someone came up to me really excited and wanted to know about the history, I would show him. I mean, I don't know, maybe people don't normally ask about this, but I'll tell you more about that shortly. It definitely seemed that he was suspicious, I can tell you that, but I was being perfectly calm. I don't know, maybe he was in a rush or something, I'm not sure, so please don't go spreading hate to this guy. I'm not saying I know anything for sure. I'm just telling you my experience. And I asked the lady if I could take a picture of the place, and she said yes, we have permission. So this dude was just standing in the middle of the store on his phone, but interestingly, he did guide me to the next part of our journey, which he told me how I could learn more about the tunnels. Basically, bro, I was literally trying to go down there for you guys, but This guy wanted me to pay $1,500 so that this tour guide could come in, rent the whole place out, and then it would be some private tour where they would teach us about Prohibition. Now, at the time, I didn't really know this because the guy was kind of being rude and he didn't want to explain anything to me. He just handed me a beer holder and then the tour number and told me to call. I was gonna wait till he got off the phone, but it was just a really weird experience. I was like, whatever. I knew what we needed to do next. We had to go on one of these tours. So come to find out, they don't really do Prohibition tours. No, all they had was this rated R tour on prostitution and corruption, and they told me that they would briefly cover Prohibition, but then she told me that the guide who did this tour was an expert on the tunnels, and he had been researching them, and he knew the most about the tunnels. I'm like, okay, let's do that, it sounded pretty cool, but they said that you don't even get to see the tunnels. So I was like, okay, we gotta do it because we gotta talk to this guy, which I'm purposely gonna leave out names here, but we get the tickets and this is a late night tour. So we get ready, and then once we get there, we kind of realize that these are all young tour guides, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just another theme common with these history museums in Charleston. Just thought I would mention. Okay, so we finally start the tour and he's telling us about Henry's, which is this super old bar in Charleston with some super messed up history. And the whole tour was just weird because this guy was young, and I don't know, I guess I was kind of expecting it to be an old guy that was just this expert on Charleston's history. It wasn't really that. It was some person right out of college trying to pay back student loans, which I totally get, but I'm just telling you who's teaching the history here. It was actually super cool, not gonna lie, so I'm not hating, but he was very well informed on the mainstream history of Charleston. One of the weird things he said was that in order to be a tour guide in Charleston or to run a business teaching history, you literally have to be licensed by the state. So he had to take this insane test with 300 questions or something, meaning they wanted to test these tour guides with rote memorization, and he had to answer them correctly if he wanted to teach Charleston's history. So everything I'm going to tell you, he got approved by the state to teach as factual history, even though he actually said a couple things that were off, but we'll get to that. So first was Henry's, where he basically exposes Charleston for being this huge brothel. I believe he said it was legal until 1970, but I don't know. That doesn't really sound right to me, but who knows, maybe there's some truth to it. Anyways, he goes on to tell us that this restaurant has a lower bar that literally is below street level, and this part of the restaurant is actually the original bar. The middle section, I believe, was the upstairs where the brothel was. So this is where he tells us that his family goes back generations in Charleston, and then he continues to talk about how Henry's originally had these little curtains that would divide into different rooms, and since everything was candlelit, you could literally hear, smell, and see all the shadows of everyone having sex. So come on, let's be honest. This was just one large drunk orgy. These sailors would come off from these long voyages, they tell us, and they were just so tired of being around men that they would come home, get drunk, and sleep with prostitutes. But they're not talking about how they didn't really care whether they were men or women. These people were something else, and supposedly, they say that women washed up between each customer. Right, like they had the time for that. They were treated like trash. With what water? Most of the streets and rivers were flooded with fecal matter causing yellow fever and cholera. He then told us some ghost stories about this place that are not really that important, but yeah, so we moved on to St. Philip's, which is the oldest church in Charleston, 1680, and he said that the steeple and porticos are actually from 1867. So what we have is basically a leaning tower, because after the Great Earthquake, it basically became off-centered, similar to the Leaning Tower of Pisa. The really weird thing about this whole tour is he was like completely talking shit on the church, which was new to me for a tour, and it wasn't in a blasphemous way. It was more so like just calling out their contradictions. For example, he told us that the first minister of the church was basically a complete drunk. He was even giving sermons drunk. So this guy was the first minister of this giant church, which is supposed to be the original Church of England. So the Church of England finds out about this and is like, you know what, you need a vacation. So they send him to Barbados, where he and his crew just basically go to rehab or something. Then they get back, and then there's this story that he comes into the church and a group of his men were sitting in the bottom floor being all strange, and they said that they had picked up an orphan in Barbados. And so the minister is like, okay, where's the baby? I want to baptize him. And they're like, he's upstairs. But the minister's like, what do you mean? You left the baby alone upstairs? And so they're just all being weird, not saying anything. So finally, the minister goes upstairs. He doesn't see a baby, but comes to find out it's a bear in a cage. So he takes the bear and baptizes the bear and literally treats the bear as a child. The town finds out about this, forms a mob, and either runs him out or kill him. I can't really remember which, but I thought that was a weird story. And also, Barbados is mentioned again with this modern minister who, it seems that many of these ministers seem to have issues, and then when that happens, they just go to take a vacation to Barbados. Oh yeah, and there was this story about a black man who climbed to the top of St. Philip's during this great fire, and he like tore off the roof or something and started yelling inside saying, "Fire, fire!" And that somehow this saved the day because of this black slave that decided to climb on top of St. Philip's. What else? Oh, and then we went to the graveyard of the circular church in the middle of the night. So that was pretty cool because we got to explore the graves, and normally this is locked, but supposedly this is one of the oldest graveyards in Charleston. And he's telling us the difference between a cemetery and a graveyard, and he says that Charleston is super petty. I'm not kidding, he said that multiple times, and one of the reasons he gave were basically the tombstones. People would pay for their tombstone to be in a graveyard, or it was the other way around, they wanted their body in the ground. Doesn't matter, the state would basically just move shit everywhere. They moved bodies several times, tombstones around, so basically nobody knows where the original bodies are. These are just tombstones that they placed here, basically. This is where I learned that all of Charleston was made from literal shit, trash, dead bodies, and shells, and then sand on top. And he was just joking about this, where he was like, oh, you've been walking over dead bodies the entire time. So, one of the interesting things that he told us about this church is that it was rebuilt right after the Civil War, which again, I don't see much evidence for other than that one photo of an entirely different building of a similar style. Even the tombstones in the early pictures are different. Then, this is where he said that Charleston was built off of symbolism. He literally said that, but he was referencing the graves, where they would put symbolism into these headstones. So for example, if your life was cut short, the grave would be broken in half. Or, I don't know, they tried to save money, or what he says was a petty move by the church. And then he goes on to say that there was this Catholic church that was pissed at this rich family for having an out-of-wedlock baby, so that when the baby died, I guess they just put it on the back of the headstone so that no one would see it. Which, I don't really believe the story at all. I mean, Charleston was literally built off of Martin Luther's philosophies. He kind of contradicts himself here because he mentioned all the brothels and corruption taking place at the beginning of the tour with Henry's restaurant. You really think the church was worried about a baby out of wedlock? They had much worse problems at the time. This is just some weird story that he was telling, and while I was looking around, and Moon found a Knights of Malta symbol on one of these graves. How about that for symbolism? If you're gonna say that Charleston is built off of symbolism, let's at least take a look at some of these other symbols in the graveyard, where he even goes on to say that there are skull and bones on these graves, but that it represents the mass amount of deaths because of these diseases like yellow fever and cholera. So you even had literal plagues as well as all the other cataclysms that I described. This is what they say, that they put the skull and bones on these graves, but with the knowledge that we know now, do you think that something else is going on? So we're getting to the end of the tour, and I'm waiting and waiting, and finally, I'm at a position where I can ask him some questions towards the end. I come up to him and I'm like, hey, so you really didn't say anything about Prohibition. I came onto this tour because the lady said you were an expert on the Prohibition tunnels. He looks at me and he's like, wait, what? How do you know about the Prohibition tunnels? And I'm telling you, he was definitely suspicious. And the funny thing is I really didn't know too much about it. I just know that it's the same story in every major city. I seriously was just asking questions to see if they had them in Charleston. I wasn't even sure. I mean, I kinda knew they had to have them. So, guys, this dude was literally the guy that they said knew the most about this subject. And not only that, the guy from the tavern wanted me to meet this guy because they're connected. So this tour guide pulls out a little journal thing, and I guess this is his research book. He really didn't have that much stuff in it that I saw, but he tells us that he just got done recently finishing a 70-page essay at the College of Charleston, I believe on the Prohibition tunnels. And remember what I was telling you about these young historians learning through memes who were just obsessed with the Romans? So he tells me that only very recently had he learned about these tunnels. He tells me that he has only known about them, including the owner of that tavern, for the last 6 months. I shit you not, that's what he says, and I'm not sure if I believe him, to be honest with you. But still, I'm sitting there thinking 6 months. And he continues to pull out a notebook and show me how I can actually see them in front of the tavern. That there are these grates that you can look through that show you these underground compartments. And I was telling him, I was like, yeah, I seen those grates all over Broad Street, but I didn't know they were right in front of the tavern too. So I'm like, okay, so how do I see one of these tunnels? Have you seen it? He's told me, he's like, oh yeah, I've been in them. And he says they go on for miles. He said that he knew of 4, but that what that lady told me at the Blind Tiger was not true at all, with there being just one tunnel. It's not one tunnel that goes from the liquor shop to St. Michael's. And actually, he even said that the Blind Tiger was never a bar. It was actually a barber shop, so they wouldn't even know. But he's like, if you want to know, what you have to do is spend $1,500 to rent the entire tavern, because him and this other young owner guy are basically little buddies. He then slips a portion to the owner, and then he gives the tour. He also told me the owner knows everything and that he knows all about this as well. Essentially, they have to be bribed. Then he pulls out a diagram showing me what one of these entrances look like. It's literally the same exact medieval arches, and he said the entire thing is bricked. Then he said that the bottom was sand or dirt, but once I questioned him further, because he was trying to say that it was built a little shorter because people back then were super short, like 5'2", and I'm like, bro, what is he talking about? First off, Lincoln was a giant, but this guy really had the audacity to say that these tunnels were built shorter, and even some other small doors in Charleston, that these were all built shorter because people were just shorter back then. And I'm like thinking, okay, if it's dirt, it probably goes even deeper. So I'm asking him, I'm like, how thick is the dirt? And he says it goes down a couple feet, and that entirely under the ground is sand and even more brick. So he says there's brick under the dirt, is what he's saying. But anyways, I really did try to get into one of these, but it didn't really seem like they were riding with me, to be honest with you. But it's cool, because I think we have all the evidence that we need. Basically, he only knows of 4 main tunnels, and he said they go on for 5 miles and that it's all over the city, not just Bay Street. Remember, he said 6 months, and this guy at the tavern sent me to this dude because he wanted me to go on that private tour. So I'm assuming that they're the only ones who really know about all this, because I asked a bunch of other shops, and not too many people have much to say on this. Which is weird, because I'm sitting here talking to the tour guide, and he's using terms like deep rabbit hole while researching this. And he also said that the city was trying to keep this under wraps. All sorts of stuff like that. And I say to him, I'm like, well, do you think anything else is going on? And he's like, no, not really. And then he just goes on to repeat the same basic things about Prohibition, right? But then you could tell that he got a little uncomfortable with me. I didn't say anything about alternative history or anything. I wasn't pushing, I was just asking questions. And even if they were to start getting curious about this, these people have no concept of any other answer. I'm really not even trying to say that in any type of way. This dude was super cool. But most of these historians just go to school, take a 300 question test by the state to test their rote memorization, then they go out and teach history, and they know all these weird stories too, right? They know about the tunnels to some degree, but most of them just think it's just some small little thing to do with a liquor store. But overall, they are super interested and curious to discover more about Charleston's past because it truly is mysterious. Yet, there's only so far that they're willing to question. You can only do so much when you have been programmed with a narrative your entire life. Well, I'm gonna ask questions. You see, I'm not a Charleston local. I can come in, view the city from a third perspective, come visit, head to Pitt Street, ride around, and just look at all the mud-flooded buildings, and there were several. Can't even show you all of them, but look at this one. I mean, this is pretty damning. This was just one random building I saw. There was a grate, I stuck my phone in it, and there you go. You have another arch. Which, what was so odd to me about Charleston is that this place is a party city now. I took a little bike cab so that you could see the nightlife, and don't get me wrong, it wasn't bad vibes or anything. I mean, everybody we talked to was nice, but the overall vibe, including even the restaurants, were essentially kind of pretentious, to be honest. It's like a college town. Everything is super expensive, but I'm riding my bike around, and there's literally a college guy peeing in the middle of the street. It just seems that some people don't really care, and all I'm trying to do is come to these cities with a new perspective, learning as much of the history as we can, and then truly questioning it from an outside alternative perspective. That's the only way you can truly test its legitimacy. Otherwise, it's almost like they worship this info. They just keep repeating it without ever wondering if there's something more. I guess let's finish up this whole trip before we get to the final theories section. But one of the last things that I did was try to get this footage of below the tavern. So what we did is we went late at night, and what do you know? You can actually see it pretty clearly. He even told me that if you look where the lights are on, that you can see the lights down there as well. Remember, this is what he said the entrance looked like. Now, they say that these are Prohibition tunnels, but I'm not so sure about that. The only reason they believe this is because of the bottles that were left behind. Is that really enough evidence? What would it take to build 5 miles of bricked underground tunnels? Check out this news video. This is from over 3 years ago. This isn't 6 months old. Maybe this is new to the tour guide and the tavern owner, but no, not in history. They've known about this for a long time. And I'm sure there are locals now who are well aware of how immense this underground system goes. And it looks like in this news video, I'll leave it in the description, but they're essentially saying that, oh, would you look at that? Charleston's flooding issues seem to have been fixed, and the answer has been below our feet for 300 years. This is what you call a cover-up. This was on the news over 3 years ago, and I don't even think the tour guide has seen it. Unless he was lying to me about only knowing this for 6 months, which is definitely possible. Check that video out because you can actually see what they look like. But yeah, this is the real deal. They're all over Charleston. The evidence is in the streets. You can walk around and look at it. He even said, open any manhole on bay, and I don't recommend doing this because it's illegal, but I'm just telling you what he said. Also, on Pitt Street, another interesting thing was some reconstruction where you can see some of the stucco is coming off, and it's an old world brick behind it. Just wanted to show you that this is what they're doing all over Charleston. Oh yeah, and remember Lake Maury? Well, this was the lake that we first visited before Columbia, and it's the man-made lake, this huge dam. Well, come to find out that there are lost towns under there. I didn't even know, but Murray is a huge name around here. Bill Murray lives here and learned earlier that that is a royal bloodline name. But check this out. The news video on Lake Murray is that this is the largest man-made lake, 50,000 acres, and they're not even allowed to fly drones, which again is understandable because it's a dam, but still, it's very secretive and sketchy, and they sank an entire city here, actually two. And guess what? Supposedly, it was a black city with a church, bridge, and many other buildings. I found that insane because I didn't even know till later, but people go exploring in these waters looking for old world ruins. This whole place just has a very eerie vibe like many other dams in the US. Oh, and speaking of eerie, I didn't really mention that the tour guide and I were making small talk and I asked him if he's seen a ghost, and he said that a couple nights ago he saw his first ghost and that before then he was a full-blown skeptic. But he said that they went to Magnolia Cemetery one night and that they all saw it and that no one could really explain it. He said that it was like a bunch of people in old clothing walking around in the middle of the night, and then all of a sudden, they were gone. He actually seemed pretty freaked out about it, and I would definitely think he was a skeptic. That's why he got so sussed out when I asked him if he thought there was anything else going on with the Prohibition tunnels. He was kind of talking down on conspiracies at the beginning of the tour because he kind of mentioned a couple from Henry's where there was this one where they killed the prostitute or something. But that's about as far as he'll go when it comes to historical conspiracies. But I guess that brings us to the final section. So what's going on with Charleston? Well, we only have really two main theories. I'll give you the mainstream, and then I'll tell you what I think, and you can make your own final conclusions. The first explanation is that Charleston's history is just weird. There's nothing fishy about it, and everything they tell us is the truth. These buildings are 300 years old. Nothing to question when it comes to how or why these buildings are several feet below the ground level, as seen evident in the old world buildings that were converted into a parking garage. Or even all the windows that are showing that it goes down another level. And don't ask any questions on how or why all this effort was being put into building all these structures downtown. Hundreds of buildings, that's millions of bricks, and it's just all how they tell us. They were shooting cannons out of these highly renovated forts. Everything, the whole story, even slavery, that the slaves built all of Charleston. That's the first explanation. You basically just walk into the museums, you learn what they tell you, and then you go to the gift shop, you read the books, and then you do what we just did. There you go. That's your first theory, the mainstream narrative. I don't really buy any of it, to be honest, and it takes a deep understanding of the occult and symbols to see this place for what it truly is. I mean, you're essentially walking on a boardwalk downtown. There's a whole other world beneath your feet. Now, if you were to ask me what I think the alternative is, well, here you go. I think we have been lied to on a grand scale. A scale so great that it is unimaginable. We have been told lies everywhere we look, and it's all because there were great resets. These great resets have happened throughout humanity's past, involving floods, fires, earthquakes, and mud volcanoes. These would create catastrophic events that would wipe cities clean. In some cases, we may need to consider something beyond our physical understanding of the world, possibly some type of spiritual event, as it is said that these inhabitants of these cities simply vanished. What I am saying is that they were grand cities in America far before what they tell us. And these cities were founded by a civilization of multicultural humans who were in a more higher state of consciousness. They did not drink nor participate in such lowly acts as going to brothels. These were not the original purpose of these buildings. It goes back to the age of Atlantis, where, after the flood, the survivors of Atlantis, who continued the knowledge and sciences from the past age, became the Druids. These Druids were multicultural priests who would not even harm a plant unnecessarily. They believed in balance with nature, and they also did not need to eat like we do today, explaining why these cities were not developed with waste management in mind. These Druids, after Atlantis, made their way to the east, creating a new empire called Tartaria, which used to be called Ancient Scythia. This is the opposite of what they tell us. They tell us that we evolved from monkeys out of Africa and that civilization was a slow migration of east to west, not west to east. Well, then Tartaria became great enough to where they actually crossed over the Bering Strait and into America. We even have evidence for this on old maps. This explains why the early colonists did not want to settle the West immediately, because there are still other nations in America that they do not tell us about 300 years ago. These cities that they did own, being on the East Coast, were prior Tartarian cities that had been hijacked and renovated by these royal bloodlines that specifically started with the Dutch East and West India Companies. This means that Charleston, all the way out to New York, are actually old world cities belonging to an entirely different civilization that have been suppressed and hidden from the history books through process of attribution and relabeling of names. This is how they were lost. These architectures were taken over, renovated, and stamped with an official history and date. These drunks weren't capable of building these structures. They were too busy putting mercury in their bums. No, these massive churches look pagan because they are just that, old world pagan structures that still survive to this day. This was done because after Tartaria had grown to encompass most of Russia and America, many cataclysms began to occur, many of which may have been purposely induced by religious cults who had obtained secret technology like the Ark of the Covenant. These devices would allow for these elite hijackers, the Phoenician Canaanite Venetians, who decided that they wanted to conquer the world, create a new world, and erase the past, had the tech to make volcanoes and comets appear, as referenced in many of their coat of arms. Now I know that may sound crazy, but even today, NASA has a document showing that they were experimenting with activating volcanoes through different techniques. Check this out. They would study the eruptions at Erebus volcano in Antarctica, where they would monitor the explosions and, quote, constrain the dynamics and mechanism of the magmatic bubble burst that can drive Strombolian and Hawaiian eruptions, end quote. Did the ancients have some type of magic technology that could make catastrophe manifest towards a directed area? They do speak of this many times in the Bible. These new hijackers not only stole the buildings, but the sciences, art, and religion of these peoples and then rewrote it for themselves. That's what we're covering with the Rosicrucians. They were taking this information and through secret occult orders, the priests then rewrote the history books under the control of the new Reformation. And so, the new church was created. This is the founding of modern day societies like the Freemasons, but it truly goes back to the Knights of Malta and the early Canaanites who worshipped Baal. This all happened because they began to worship another body in times of cataclysm so that they could survive. Baal was a fertility god. They just didn't want to go hungry. So, they started sacrificing each other, and then, after that, they started eating each other. This is the origin of eating flesh. We see that humanity fell into the Dark Age. No waste management, shit and disease spread everywhere, and so they relocated into these cities and had no concept on how to clean it. Multiple bloodlines were a part of this rebuilding state of creating the new world. and we have mentioned several throughout all our videos, but in this video, we're highlighting the Moorish royal bloodlines that for some reason never seem to be brought up in mainstream history. I think the enemy is beyond color, but the truth is, as I see it, is that blacks were a part of this process of enslaving not only their own people, but humanity. The Moors were the first ancient pirates, and we will now switch for a moment to using Moor in a more royal sense when we use the word, in order to distinguish between ancient Moorish humans and then the Moors who participated in the hijack. The Moorish families made up the majority of royal European bloodlines. Not all, being that most of them were mulatto, as we mentioned with King George II. We also showed that most Europeans are swarthy or dark-skinned according to Benjamin Franklin. We also cover how Spain was dominated by Moors for 300 years in mainstream history. Yet, they leave out how when they were supposedly kicked out, they moved to France and went underground as these French Protestants named the Huguenots, who, we know for a fact, were one of the earliest settlers of South Carolina. These ancient colonial French Protestants were not only Moors, but they were Sephardic Jews and the Arab Moors. They were literally connected with the Venetian royal bloodline, which now we understand that black nobility isn't just talking about families in the shadow. It's literally talking about families with a darker complexion. And these Moorish families are the bloodlines that participated in capturing and hijacking of many New World cities in America. It wasn't just black people, all colors participated in this hijack. But you'll see this common point in black supremacist circles that, oh, the white man came in and took our land, they brought diseases and all this stuff. Wait, what are you talking about? Most of the Europeans at this time, including Columbus or mulattoes, they had Moorish blood in their veins. I just think it's toxic to assume that one phenotype is responsible for all the destruction of humanity. We will never solve our issues this way. But I think this is very important to understand because we are all well aware of the role that the white royal families play in this agenda of slavery and control. But we don't normally ask, wait, what happened with all the black royal families? Why were these swept under the rug? Is it because this whole narrative of slavery is a part of this narrative of control as indicated by the coat of arms? This was their secret tool of enslavement, identity crisis, to leave humans confused as to its origin. One person would be constantly the victim, and one person would constantly be the oppressor. And this would allow for the new world to be created, with Venice or the lion in control. So these cities, including Charleston, were then founded after being ordered by these newly founded corporations like Dutch India companies, and they would order these explorers to go find new ventures, and that's how these cities were founded. Well, it is said that the best pirates were the Moors and that they were also skilled builders. Now, I don't think these royal Moors built these structures. I think they came in and did some renovation and prepared the city for a reset, and I think they're even the ones who came up with this whole slave narrative, as you can see in old pictures from the early 1900s of black Freemasons and Oddfellows in South Carolina, Columbia. Whoa, wait, hold up. What about Jim Crow laws? This is 50 years before that. They were Freemasons? I am of the opinion that the original inhabitants of these cities were the Druids, or what we call Tartarians, but it wasn't just one race. It was multicultural. So yes, there were blacks there, but there were multiple cultures, as the Druids go back all the way to Atlantis, so they had found balance with one another. It was these royal bloodlines who came in and saw everything on the basis of color. They became reptilian in their thinking, most likely the fight for survival. This explains why the flag of South Carolina is the way it is, because these Islamic Moors came in under the control of these royal bloodlines who were mulattoes in many cases, and so they came in, took over an abandoned city for this great lion of Venice. This original city was probably far greater than we can imagine, as Charleston has gone through several disasters, including plagues and the World Fair buildings that were destroyed after being labeled as just a temporary construction that was built in only a single year. It explains why there are these massive tunnels and underground levels to Charleston that no one seems to be able to explain. This used to be a massive city that was owned by an entirely different civilization. Then, mud volcanoes started erupting, causing poisonous gases to be released at a fast rate, killing most of the population. Then, these pirates came in, found the land buried in mud. There were no inhabitants left, and so they started digging. Once they got everything out of the mud, they started building on top of it. This is what we mean by mud flood. These buildings all have their first floor under street level, but they tell us this is just how they built buildings. Yet, does it make sense now why they put the door on the second level or on the side, or there's no front door at all, or even all these crawl spaces? How you can literally even see these windows are below street level. Was it because many of these buildings were covered in mud and the ground liquefied to a certain degree, as seen in many earthquakes? It's called liquefaction, and these buildings begin to sink into the earth, causing even more confusion. The vast amount of these buildings could not be explained by traditional means, so this is why they had to destroy most of it. Some cataclysms were natural, but many were cover-ups so that they could destroy most of the city using these cannons. There was so much wealth in this city, and so this new world couldn't allow any of that. So they created this fake narrative, and that's what we call mainstream history. It's the history that you see when you walk into any of these museums. They tell you that all the slaves built all of this while they were being treated as subhuman. What if that's not the case? And this is but a story to give us identity crisis, so that we'll never know how great humanity was once in its past, her great achievements, and this past civilization knowing free energy, which they so desperately needed to erase if their new petroleum-based depth system was to thrive. Their whole agenda was designed to work based on wiping cities clean, populating them with orphans, and then the elite orphans would be a part of a club, or the ones most liked by the state. They would be what we know as Oddfellows or Freemasons, the secret societies of orphans who have no idea what their history was because it was erased. They basically participate in continuing this process of erasing humanity's histories. They're the ones supplying us with most of this data. I mean, they're the ones that stamp all the books, flags, and buildings. They fund the education systems. Of course their symbol would be the double-headed phoenix, because this goes back to royal bloodlines that arose after the fall of Tartaria in the Aryan multicultural brotherhood. Essentially, these mystery schools became corrupted over time, and so they turned into the Canaanites. Then, they sought to create a new empire, all under the control of the lion through the procedure of the double-headed phoenix, set the world aflame, created anew through divide and conquer. But things are changing. People are waking up and seeing the symbols. The symbols that they cherish so much will be their downfall. We can see the similarities between the Confederate symbols, skull and bones, and the pirate flags. We can see that yes, the palmetto is not original to South Carolina, and there does seem to be a cover-up involving not only the flag, but the story behind many of the blacks in South Carolina. I believe that many of the people there are inhabitants or aborigines from a prior civilization in America, but many are also migrants that came in from Europe that we know were of a dark complexion. Not too many know that even George Washington was said to be a Moor. Look, I'm just showing you the info. So we know that the Huguenots were Moors, right? Well, if you look up George Washington's ancestry, would you look at that? Nicholas Marshall. Quote, "For there was a distinct French Huguenot strain in the lineage of George Washington. It came to him from his first American ancestor, Nicholas Marshall, a Huguenot refugee who came to Virginia in 1620. So there you go. They're telling you that he was black, basically because the Huguenots were Moorish Sephardic Jews. I even have this article from this Dutch black guy claiming that many Germans and Dutch royals were black, that they just came in and whitewashed everything later. Think about it. Martin Luther King was named after the German or Dutch gay monk Martin Luther, which now we can question whether or not this figure was black or not. But I find it interesting that they would name the main civil rights leader after the founder of original liberalism, the Protestant martyr, or at least symbolically, Martin Luther. And yes, it was liberalism back then. They could come and believe in whatever they want, when the most conservative belief at the time was the Catholic Church and the idea that you must do good works and actually be a good person to get into heaven. And I'm not saying I'm on either side. The Catholic Church has its own problems, but we have to see this for what it is: divide and conquer. Now, I think they suppressed this because this is a part of an even greater agenda. In order to keep humanity enslaved, one race needed to take the blame for the world's problems, and the other needed to be the victim. Problem, reaction, solution. They needed a reason for the Civil War. They needed reasons to do the actions that they were about to do, which was essentially pillaging civilizations, killing the survivors, and burning all of the books and or rewriting them. Then they came in, took ownership of the remaining architecture, and this wasn't just given to them by the natives. So they started renovating these empty cities on a mass scale. They added all these porticos to match many of the real porticos that are probably seen in, for instance, on some of the churches, but then they came in and added their style of Phoenician ornamentation and their coat of arms to say, hey, I own this now. Yet they can't even rebuild structures like this today, much less anything near the resemblance of the Charleston World Fair. Imagining all this is no easy task, and I'm only scratching the surface. This is not something we're taught growing up. We are not taught to think in this way, and it's not to say that this is the truth, but would you rather your mind be constrained to the thought stream that these elite royals have designed for you? All we can do is just ask questions right now. That's literally it. And my thoughts are the product of researching many of these topics, including royal bloodlines, the occult, lost ancient civilizations, time fraud, Tartaria, cryptids, and all sorts of things that really make me curious when it comes to questioning these cities in reality. I think that's a better approach because we can discover so much more when approaching it in that method. I didn't even get to mention everything about Charleston. There's more buildings, stories. There really is just so much. I'm curious to see what you guys think and the connections you make. Please, if you do decide to visit Charleston, do not bother any of the locals, nor should you make any insults or harass any of these business owners or tour guides. I honestly think they just don't know. They grew up hearing all the same stories, then they go to the College of Charleston, one of the oldest colleges, or at least I'm talking about the ones who are interested in history go here, right? So then they get programmed with Roman and Greek history, and then the ones who want to participate in the tours or museums are required by the state to take an exam on all this stuff, and they have to get a license in order to prove that they're teaching factual history. I do think that everyone there is super kind though. The only bad vibes were the abandoned buildings and cemeteries, but other than that, it was one of the most amazing experiences we have ever had going on a trip. Again, this is kind of all new to me, so it was really mind-blowing. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And also, a couple things. If you're interested in translations of MU, we have German and Spanish channels that we're currently building up. If you have any questions or want to participate in cultivating curiosity, please join the Discord. It's super fun, and not knowing isn't really an excuse. We'll walk you through it, so new people are really coming in all the time. So yeah, click the link and we'll show you everything. But with that, I thank you for making it to the end of the video, sending you guys all love, and all we can hope is that our minds may be unveiled.
Let go of everything you think to be true. Relax the mind and ask the question, do I truly understand what this reality is?